Now that we've defined the problem and determined the scope and magnitude of it through our operational measures, we can move into the next step and figure out what policies should be developed to actually address the problem. In doing so, we need to consider two sub-steps to this process. The first is we need to set our goals, and then we can construct our alternatives. Setting goals is nothing more than determining what policy outcomes we want to achieve with the policy we ultimately adopt. Think back to the example of the immigration bill that was passed in Alabama. What was the goal there? Ultimately, to reduce the number of people with undocumented status. Consider the other examples you looked at concerning the unemployment rate or college debt. You can pretty easily determine what the policy outcomes were from those. In setting their goals, policy analysts will often consider what the root and proximate causes were to the problem. This will help dictate what policies they ultimately want to advocate for. Do you think you can reach the root of the problem? Or are you only going to be able to address the proximate causes? In doing so, the chosen policies should get at the causes, either the root or proximate, should meet the goals that they set forth, and in doing so, address the public policy problem. Once you have set your goals, now you can move on to actually figure out what alternatives can be constructed to address the problem at hand. From prior modules and your reading of your textbook, you should know that there are a variety of policy instruments that are available to policy analysts and policymakers. Further, there are a multitude of approaches that policymakers can engage in. Policy analysts and policymakers ultimately want to consider how the approach that they choose will impact people's behavior. Remember, policy comes from institutions, and institutions shape the behavior of individuals. Thus, these actors need to consider the consequences of action. They have to be concerned with who the target population is regarding the policy they want to enact. A target population is who will essentially be impacted by the policy. These actors have to think about, will the policy hurt or harm these populations or constituency groups? Will they benefit from it? What will their response be? And further, will they view the policy as legitimate? Okay, let's review the instruments of policy at the disposal of the policymakers and that policy analysts will consider. First, you have the idea of government regulations. The government can pass policies that regulate government behavior. In doing so, they can create agencies that ultimately are in charge of doing this. Take OSHA, for example. That's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. This agency assures safe and healthy working conditions for men and women across the country by setting and enforcing standards. OSHA regulates both the private and the public sector. Next, the government can subsidize practices and behavior for the benefit of the country as a whole. Think about student loans. You can get subsidized student loans where essentially the government pays the interest while you're in school. Why would it do that? Highly educated individuals are beneficial to the economy of the United States as a whole. You make more money, which can be taxed. You supply labor and keep unemployment down, and create products which can be taxed as well, bringing revenue back to the government. Next, the government can impose taxes or give tax deductions. Take something like a vice tax, or a tax on something like cigarettes or alcohol. The government can offer market incentives, which are essentially a special category of taxation or spending. You can think of something like a tax rebate. It can charge fees for specific services, consider a hunting or a fishing license. It can educate the public, consider something like food safety labels. It can conduct its own research and subsidize research through the National Science Foundation or the National Institute of Health. It can actually provide direct services like police and fire. Further, it can privatize or contract out services. Think about prisons today. Some are provided by the private sector. Finally, it can create public trusts. This can regulate public behavior and protect certain things like land. We'll talk about green spaces in later modules. Taken together, the government has a lot of instruments at its disposal to deal with public policy problems. Clearly, these are a lot of policy tools. As such, two academics back in the late 90s, Schneider and Ingram, tried to figure out which policies were adopted and why we selected those policies. As I noted earlier, policymakers and policy analysts will consider how the approach will impact people's behavior. Thus, the policy design, where an analyst considers how the various components of a policy fit together and how they are likely to work to solve the problem, consider what actions the government will take and how they will affect these target populations. Thus, in analyzing the likely behaviors, They will choose the policy tools, all those ones we just went over, will fit best. To better understand this, Schneider and Ingram developed a set of categories or a certain typology to describe all of these tools and consider the likely behaviors of the individuals involved. Schneider and Ingram's typology consists of 5 different types of tools, which consider the likely behaviors of the implementors and those being targeted by the policy. The first set of tools are authority tools. These are statements backed by legitimate authority. They're mainly used to guide behavior of agents and officials. Think of it as granting permission or making something compulsory. The next set of tools are incentive tools. They rely on tangible payoffs. These can be positive or negative to induce compliance or encourage use. It's based on the idea of rationality. Remember, costs versus benefits. Individuals won't act unless they're induced to act. Basically, whether the cost becomes too great or the benefits are too great to ignore. The next set of tools are capacity tools. These provide information, training, education, and resources to enable the target population to make decisions or carry out activities. Next, we have symbolic or encouraging tools. These tools assume that people act or not based upon their beliefs or values. They comply if they see behavior as consistent with their own beliefs. The final set of tools are learning tools. The goal is to move target populations to take problem-solving action through the acquisition of information. These tools help the target population synthesize information and then make a choice based upon the information about whether to act or not.